The auctioneer's voice carried across the square like something that couldn't be taken back. Clara Whitmore stood in the open, 24 years old, her father's hand no longer on her arm because he had stepped back, so the crowd could get a better look at what he was selling. She heard laughter. She heard someone call out a number. She felt the sun on her face and thought, absurdly, that it was a beautiful morning for the worst moment of her life. If you've ever been made to feel like you were worth nothing, stay with me. This story doesn't end where it begins. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The morning had started as an ordinary one, which was the cruelest part of it in hindsight. Clara had risen before the sun, the way she always did. She'd built the fire from the night's cold ashes, set water to boil, sliced the last of the salt pork thin enough that it might stretch to cover both their breakfasts. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had been at the kitchen table already when she came downstairs, which was unusual because Edmund rarely rose before 8, and it was not yet 6. He had his boots on. His good coat, the one he saved for church and court hearings, was folded over the back of his chair. She should have noticed. She told herself later, over and over, through the kind of obsessive accounting that only grief produces. She should have noticed the boots, the coat, the fact that he wouldn't quite meet her eyes when she set his coffee in front of him. "We're going into Harlan today," he said. "I thought we needed to wait until Thursday for the feed delivery." She sat across from him with her own cup, wrapping both hands around the warmth of it. "Change of plans." He picked up his coffee, looked into it rather than at her. "Get dressed in something decent." She hadn't owned anything indecent. That had always been part of the trouble. Clara was not a woman who invited attention, and the attention she did invite was never the kind she wanted. She was large in a way that the frontier did not forgive easily, broad through the shoulders and heavy through the hips, with a face that was handsome enough in good light, but suffered under the particular cruelty of a crowd. Harlan's population had been commenting on Clara Whitmore's body since she was 12 years old. By 24, she had learned to move through the town like something that didn't require acknowledgement, quickly, practically, with her eyes forward and her jaw set. She put on her blue wool dress. It was the nicest thing she owned by default, because the others were worse. They took the wagon into town. Edmund drove. Clara sat beside him and watched the hills roll past, the dry grass pale as straw in the September morning, and thought about what she needed from the general store. Flour, coffee, thread. She'd run out of the dark brown, and there were 2 pairs of work trousers that needed mending before winter. She had a list in her pocket, written in her small, neat hand. She never got to use it. The square in Harlan was already busy when they arrived, which was the second thing she should have noticed. It was a Tuesday. Harlan Square was busy on Saturdays, occasionally on Fridays when the cattle buyers came through. On a Tuesday morning, it should have been half empty. Maybe a few merchants taking deliveries, the post office doing its quiet business. Instead, there were at least 40 people. More arriving. Clara climbed down from the wagon and looked around with a small frown. "What's going on?" Edmund Whitmore did not answer her. He stepped around the wagon, took her by the arm, not gently, and walked her forward. She went along with it for about 20 feet before something in the quality of the crowd's attention stopped her. They were looking at her. Not at Edmund, not at the square in general, at her. With the particular fixed quality of people who had come somewhere to watch something and were now watching it. "Pa!" She pulled against his grip. "Pa, what is this?" "Hold still." His voice was low and hard, the voice he used when there was no room for argument. He had many voices. This was the one she had learned not to fight, but her feet slowed anyway, because her body understood something her mind was still refusing, and then she saw the auctioneer. Gerald Fitch had been running public auctions in Harlan for 20 years. He stood on the raised wooden platform outside the land office, where estate sales and livestock auctions, and once, when Clara was 9 years old and hadn't understood what she was watching, an auction of labor contracts that had made her mother cry quietly all the way home. Fitch was a thin man with a voice that didn't match his frame, enormous and carrying, the kind of voice that could move through wind and crowd noise like it was walking through an open door. He had his ledger open. Edmund Whitmore walked his daughter up to the base of that platform, and Clara's feet stopped working entirely. "Pa," her voice came out wrong, too small. Pa, what are you doing? It wasn't a question. She knew the shape of what this was. She understood it the way you understand a door slamming in a dark house, before you can see anything, just from the sound and the sudden absence of warmth. You're 24 years old, Edmund said, not looking at her. I'm 61 and my back is gone. I can't afford to keep a household I can't work. Fitch is going to transfer your guardian contract to someone who can use the arrangement better. I'm not property. The words came out flat. Pa, I'm your daughter. I'm not. You're 24 and unmarried, and you live under my roof. He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not cruelty exactly, which would have been easier to bear. It was discomfort, like a man doing something that annoyed him rather than something that destroyed someone else. This is a legal arrangement. It's done every day. It is not done every... He stepped back. That was the moment, the exact physical moment, when Clara understood that nothing she said was going to matter. Edmund Whitmore stepped back and Gerald Fitch stepped forward, and the crowd, which had been watching with the quiet attention of people who'd paid for their seats, began to murmur. She stood on the platform because there was nowhere to go. She thought about running and immediately understood that she could not run, not because anyone was physically preventing her, but because her legs had turned into something that didn't receive instruction. She stood on the raised wood and looked out at Harlan, and Harlan looked back at her. She recognized almost every face. Millicent Howe, who had told her 11-year-old daughter not to play with Clara because Clara was that heavy Whitmore girl. Tom Abernethy, who had made the same joke about her at the feed store for 6 years running. The Platt sisters, who were approximately her age and had never once spoken to her with any warmth. Ruth DeLacy, who was not unkind exactly, but who was standing there watching this happen without any expression that suggested she intended to stop it. And then the men. The ones Fitch began addressing. The ones who were apparently interested in the arrangement. She heard prices. She heard her father's name. She heard Gerald Fitch describe her. And she felt this as a physical sensation, like something being pulled off her skin, in terms of usefulness. Strong girl, good worker, experienced with household management, comes with knowledge of the property. Her father's land, his debts, the outstanding note at the bank, all of it mentioned, because apparently what was being offered was not just Clara, but the whole entangled mess of her life as it currently existed. She stopped listening. She focused on a fixed point on the far side of the square, the water trough outside the livery stable, and she did not move her eyes from it, and she did not let her face change, because if her face changed in front of these people, she would not recover from it. She was aware of voices, numbers, a particular laugh from somewhere in the crowd. She knew that laugh. She didn't look toward it. She kept her eyes on the trough. She was aware of the smell of the crowd and the warmth of the September sun and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyard behind the main street and the sound of a child asking its mother what was happening and the mother's quiet hush. She was aware that this was the moment her life changed and that she had no say in it. The bidding, from what she pieced together afterward, lasted about 8 minutes. She did not know the number it stopped at, and she did not want to. When Fitch's gavel came down, and he said the name of the winning bidder, she didn't catch it. Some last protective instinct had pushed her hearing down to a low, underwater murmur. She climbed off the platform because Fitch gestured for her to do so. She walked to where her father was standing, and she looked at him. "Clara," he started. "Don't," she said. He handed her a small bundle, her things from the wagon. She'd packed for a supply run, not for the end of her life. There was a change of linen, a small sewing kit, her mother's ring that she kept in a handkerchief because she never wore it for fear of losing it. That was all. She took the bundle. She looked at her father one more time. She had things she wanted to say to him, and she said none of them, because the crowd was still there, and she had already given them enough. She turned and walked toward the edge of the square. She made it to the alley beside the saddle shop before her legs informed her they were done cooperating. She sat on a crate behind a stack of empty shipping boxes and put her hands on her knees and stared at the dirt between her feet. The alley smelled like leather and horse and dry wood. It was not particularly clean. She sat there anyway. She was not crying. She had moved past the temperature at which tears form and into something colder, something that sits below the sternum and hums quietly and does not respond to comfort because it has already decided that comfort is not available. She tried to think practically. It was all she had. She was 24 years old, she had a change of linen, a sewing kit, and her mother's ring. She was standing in a town where everyone knew her face and nobody had tried to stop what just happened. She had no horse, no money, no clear sense of who had just become her legal guardian, and no plan. Her practical mind ran through options and kept running into walls. She could go to the county office and contest the arrangement. She'd heard of women doing this, challenging their guardian contracts when they could demonstrate they were capable of independent management. But she had no lawyer and no money to pay for one, and the county clerk was Amos Fitch, Gerald's cousin, and she was under no illusions about how that inquiry would go. She could walk. There was Dalton, 2 days east on foot. She knew no one there. She had no money for lodging. September was still warm, but it wouldn't last, and she did not have winter clothes in the bundle her father had handed her. She could go back and present herself to whoever had just purchased the right to her labor and her residence, and try to make the best of it. That last option tasted like sawdust, but it was an option. She heard footsteps stop at the mouth of the alley. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. The man standing there was not anyone she recognized from the crowd, which surprised her. She thought she'd known every face. He was tall, somewhere in his late 30s, with the build of someone who worked outdoors and the kind of quiet that she associated with people who had been alone a lot. His hat was plain, his coat was worn at the elbows, and he was holding hers. Her scarf, she realized, the brown wool one she hadn't even noticed dropping. "You dropped this." He held it out. "In the square, when you were—" He paused, apparently deciding not to complete that sentence, which she appreciated. She took the scarf. "Thank you." He didn't leave. "I'm Gideon Hale," he said. "I run a place called the Cutler Creek Ranch, about 9 miles west." She looked at him steadily. "I know what your name means in the context of this morning." He accepted this without flinching. "I expect you do." "What do you want?" "I want you to know what it doesn't mean," he said, "because I think you're sitting here deciding what kind of situation you're walking into, and you deserve accurate information." "You paid money for my guardian contract," she said. "What in that sentence is inaccurate?" "The implication." He shifted his weight, not uncomfortable exactly, but careful, like a man who understood he was standing in a space where any wrong word would be permanent. "I bid on your contract because Harlan Coggins was about to win it. Coggins runs a boarding house and a great deal else besides, and the kind of contract he was interested in wasn't the housekeeping variety." Clara looked at him. "I don't know you," Gideon Hale continued. "I have no use for a wife. I have a considerable use for someone who can manage a household that's been going sideways for 3 years, and I'll pay fair wages for that work, and your contract will be yours to dissolve the moment you choose to dissolve it. That's not an arrangement I'm inventing to tell you what you want to hear. That's the arrangement I went in there intending to make." He said all of this in a level, quiet way, not like a man trying to persuade her, more like a man reading a set of figures he'd already calculated. Something in the plainness of it made her look at him more carefully. "Why would you do that?" she said. "Spend money you presumably need on a stranger's problem." "Because Harlan Coggins has done that before," he said simply. "And I was standing there, and I had the money." It was an insufficient answer, and also, somehow, the most honest thing she'd heard all morning. She stood up from the crate, her legs held. "I'm not agreeing to anything." "I'm not asking you to." He stepped back to give her room. "My wagon's at the north end of the square. I need to pick up some lumber, and then I'm heading back to the ranch. You're welcome to ride along and see the place. After that, it's your choice." He walked away back toward the square, not looking to see if she followed. She stood in the alley for another full minute. Then she picked up her bundle and walked after him. The wagon was loaded with lumber by the time she reached it. Gideon Hale hoisting planks without particular ceremony, a young ranch hand named Dex, who couldn't have been more than 16 and kept sneaking glances at her like she was a problem he'd been asked to solve, handing them up from the stack. Nobody in the immediate vicinity said anything to her. This was already an improvement on the last hour. She climbed up onto the bench. Gideon finished with the lumber, and Dex scrambled up into the wagon bed, and they pulled out onto the main road heading west, and Clara sat with her bundle in her lap and watched Harlan disappear behind them. She did not look back. The road west out of town ran along the base of a long, dry ridge before turning down into a valley system that she'd never had much reason to visit. The Cutler Creek territory was ranching country. Open grass, scattered cottonwoods along the waterways, the kind of landscape that looked simple from a distance and was complicated up close. She'd heard the name Cutler Creek her whole life. She'd never been out this way. Gideon Hale drove in silence, which she didn't find uncomfortable. She was not a woman who needed noise. She watched the grass and thought about what she was doing, which was, she was honest with herself, almost certainly a mistake. She knew nothing about this man beyond 20 minutes of conversation in which he had said all the right things in exactly the right order, and she was not naive enough to think that was a good sign. And yet she had sat in that alley and run through every other option, and they all ended worse. At least this one moved. At least this one had her sitting in a wagon heading somewhere rather than sitting on a crate behind the saddle shop. "How bad is it?" she asked after they'd been on the road about 20 minutes. He glanced at her. "How bad is what?" "The ranch. You said it's been going sideways for 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She got the sense he was actually thinking about how to answer honestly, rather than looking for a version that made things sound better. "The land is good," he said finally. "The herd was good until 2 years ago, when I lost about 40 head to a sickness in the south pasture. Water access is decent. We're on Cutler Creek, which is why the name. The house is standing. The barn needs new planks on the east wall, which is what the lumber's for." He paused. "The finances are a mess." "What kind of mess?" "The kind I don't entirely understand," he said. And she heard something in his voice she recognized, the faint, specific frustration of a man who was good at one kind of work and had found himself failing at another. "I'm a fair rancher. I am not a fair accountant. I've been keeping my own books since my wife died, and I'm reasonably certain I'm doing something wrong, but I can't find where." "When did she die?" 4 years ago. Clara looked at the grass. "I'm sorry." "It was a bad winter." He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask him to. They came down into the valley, and the land changed character. The grass was longer here, greener, and she could hear the creek before she could see it, a low, persistent sound underneath the wagon noise. The road curved, and there it was, a valley spread wide and handsome in the September afternoon light, the creek threading through it, a house and a cluster of outbuildings on a slight rise to the north. It was not a prosperous-looking place. The house needed paint. The fence line along the near pasture was repaired in 3 places with different materials, making it look like something that had kept getting hurt and kept being fixed with whatever was available. One of the outbuildings was half dismantled, apparently mid-project. But the land. She could see why he'd said the land was good. The grass was deep, and the creek ran clear, and the hills curved around the valley like hands cupped around something worth keeping. She didn't say anything about it. Dex jumped down to open the gate, and they pulled through, and there was another ranch hand, older, maybe 50, with a pronounced limp and a squint that suggested he'd been looking into the sun for 30 years, waiting by the barn. "That's Dutch," Gideon said. "He runs the hands. There are 2 others, Clem and Roy, but they're out on the south pasture today." Dutch regarded her from his distance with the focused attention of a man taking inventory. She returned the look without apology. "Miss Whitmore," Gideon said, which she supposed was an introduction, and Dutch nodded once and went back to what he'd been doing. Well, he showed her the house. It was the house of a man who had been alone for 4 years, which was to say it was not dirty, exactly, but it had the quality of a place that had been maintained by someone who was doing it purely out of necessity rather than any investment in the result. The kitchen was functional but grim. The main room had furniture that had been pushed to the walls and never moved back to any natural arrangement. There were stacks of paper on the desk in the small room off the kitchen, ledgers, receipts, what looked like correspondence, that had accumulated in the specific pattern of someone who had been putting off dealing with something for a very long time. "That's the accounting," he said, seeing her look at it. She crossed to the desk, and he watched her, and she picked up the top ledger and opened it. She was not an accountant. She'd never had formal training, but she was the daughter of Edmund Whitmore, who had been moderately terrible with money his entire life. And from the time she was 14, she had been the one keeping their household books. She understood columns and debits and the particular way numbers tell the truth, even when the person writing them down is trying to avoid it. She looked at the open page for about 45 seconds. "This is in the wrong order," she said. "What?" "You're recording expenses before income, and you're not dating the entries consistently. So when you try to reconcile at the end of the month, you're comparing things that didn't happen in the same time period and calling it a loss." She turned a few pages. "Also, someone's been billing you twice for the same delivery. See this? Feed delivery, 23rd. And then again, 23rd, different line, half the amount. That happens to a lot of people. They don't always notice." Gideon Hale was quiet. "It's not unfixable," she said, which was not the same as saying it was fixed. She set the ledger down. "Where would I sleep?" He showed her a room at the end of the upstairs hall. It was small and had a single window looking out over the east pasture. There was a bed, a washstand, a peg on the wall for clothes. It was nothing. It was also, she realized, hers. The first room in her memory that would belong to her and not to anyone else's assessment of how much space she was entitled to. "Wages," she said. "You mentioned wages." $12 a month, he said. "Same as the hands." She considered this. "I want 14. He considered her. 13. 14. "I'll earn it." Another pause. "All right." She set her bundle on the bed. "I'm not making any promises about staying," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'll work. I'll keep to myself. But I'm not promising anything beyond that." "I didn't ask for promises," he said. He left her to settle in. She stood in the small room with its east-facing window and its single peg and its smell of dust and old wood, and she thought that she had made a significant mistake, probably, and also that she had no way of knowing yet. She unpacked her bundle. There was almost nothing to unpack. She put the change of linen on the shelf, hung the sewing kit on the peg, tucked her mother's ring and the handkerchief into the drawer of the washstand. She washed her face with the cold water in the pitcher. She went downstairs. Dinner that first evening was a disorganized affair. Clara discovered by investigating the kitchen that there was flour, salt pork, 3 small potatoes, and a quantity of dried beans that had been sitting in a sack long enough that she was uncertain about their condition. She used the potatoes and the salt pork and made a pan of cornbread from the flour, and she served it without ceremony at the kitchen table where Gideon and Dutch and Dex and the other 2 hands, Clem, who was large and quiet, and Roy, who was neither, sat and ate without complaint. Nobody thanked her. She wasn't expecting thanks. After, when the others had gone and Gideon was making a pretense of looking at the ledger she'd touched earlier, she sat at the other end of the kitchen table and wrote out a list of what was needed from town. Real list this time. Not flour and thread and proper account paper and ink and 6 months' worth of receipts sorted in date order so she could begin to understand what she was actually looking at. She heard him set the ledger down. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. "I don't—" He stopped. Started again, more carefully. "I want to be clear about something, about what I said this morning regarding the nature of the arrangement. You were clear. I want to make sure you believed me." She looked at him steadily. He was sitting in the lamplight at the other end of the table, and he had the expression of a man who was not comfortable with the particular thing he was trying to say, and was saying it anyway because he had decided it needed to be said. "I believed you were honest," she said. "Whether I believe the situation will remain as described, that remains to be seen." "Fair enough." "It generally is," she said, and went back to her list. She could feel him watching her for a moment. Then she heard his chair shift, and the sound of him picking up the ledger again, and the scratch of his pen. They sat at opposite ends of the table in the lamplight, not speaking, and the silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had not yet decided what they were to each other and were not pretending otherwise. She finished her list. She folded it and put it in her pocket beside the one she'd never used. Outside, the September night had dropped to cold, and the creek made its soft sound in the dark. And somewhere in the south pasture, something called out and was quiet again. The lamp burned steady. Clara Whitmore sat at a stranger's table in a house she hadn't chosen, and thought about the morning, and then deliberately stopped thinking about it, because nothing in the practice of reliving it was going to change what had happened, and she had work to do. She would stay 1 week and see. That was all she promised herself. 1 week. The week turned into 2, and then 3, and the shape of her days at Cutler Creek settled into something that surprised her by feeling not comfortable. She was careful not to call it comfortable, but purposeful. She was not accustomed to that sensation. Edmund Whitmore's household had given her plenty to do, but the doing of it had never felt like it mattered. He would have fed himself from a tin and let the books rot without particular concern. His house had been a container for his life, not a project, and her work in it had been maintenance, not building. Here, things needed actual building. She started with the accounts because that was where the bleeding was worst. She spent 4 days sorting through the accumulated correspondence and receipts in the small office, organizing by date, cross-referencing against the ledgers, identifying the double billing, which turned out to be not accidental but systematic. The feed supplier, a company out of Dalton called Marchetti Brothers, had been routinely adding half charges to deliveries. Small amounts, $5, $7. Never enough to be obviously alarming, but consistent across 3 years of records. She found 26 instances of it. She sat with that for a while before she decided what to do with the information. Then she fixed the kitchen. Not dramatically, she wasn't a dramatic person, but systematically. She reorganized the stores so she could see what was actually there. She got the cook stove's second burner to stop sticking. She repaired the draft on the chimney flue by adjusting the damper that had been set wrong, probably for years, which was why the kitchen filled with smoke every time someone built the fire too high. She repaired 4 shirts for Dutch without being asked, because she had thread and he clearly didn't. She noticed that the water situation for the house was needlessly complicated. They were hauling from the creek rather than using the well behind the kitchen, which she assumed was dry, but wasn't, had just had its rope replaced with one too short to reach. She told Dex about it. He fixed it in an afternoon and looked startled at himself for solving something so efficiently. She noticed everything. She always had. It was one of the things she did with her attention that nobody had ever found useful before. It was in her 3rd week, on a gray Thursday morning when the wind had turned and smelled like the season remembering it was supposed to be fall, that she found the other ledger. She'd been looking for a record book that Gideon had mentioned, some preliminary accounts from a business arrangement with a neighboring cattle operation, something he'd been vague about in a way she was beginning to find less vague and more concerning. He'd said it would be in the bottom desk drawer. The bottom drawer stuck, and when she finally got it open, behind the record book he'd mentioned was another one, thinner, older, different handwriting. She sat down and read it. She read it twice, carefully. Then she sat with it closed in her hands and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she went to find Gideon Hale. He was at the barn, working on the east wall replacement, measuring planks while Dutch held them. She waited until he looked up. "When you have a minute," she said. Something in her voice made him hand Dutch the measuring tape immediately. They walked to the far side of the barn, away from the hands. Clara had the ledger under her arm. "Where did this come from?" she asked, holding it out. He looked at it. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely read. "Where'd you find it?" "Bottom of the desk, behind the book you told me to look for." She kept her voice level. "I need you to tell me what it is." He took it, turned it over, opened it to the middle. She watched him look at the pages with the specific expression of a man who has avoided looking at something for a long time and is now being made to look at it. "This is from before Eleanor died," he said. "Before I was keeping the books myself." "She kept the accounts?" "She was better at it than me." Clara had thought so, from the quality of the handwriting, neat, precise, consistent in a way his entries never were. "Read the last 6 months of entries," she said. He read. She watched the color change in his face, slow and unmistakable, the way anger comes when it's the kind rooted in something that's been quietly true for a very long time. "This is—" He stopped. "Silas Voss's name appears 47 times in 8 months, she said. "Your wife recorded every transaction she had with him, every arrangement, every payment. And the numbers don't match what's in your main ledger. The amounts are different, sometimes by a little, sometimes by quite a lot. Eleanor always said there was something wrong with how Voss structured the grazing rights agreement," Gideon said slowly. He wasn't looking at the book anymore, looking past it. I thought she was I thought she was being careful. She was always more careful than me. She wasn't being careful, Clara said. She was documenting. She knew something was wrong, and she was writing it down. She paused. Silas Voss has been taking money from this ranch for a long time, Gideon. I don't know all of it yet, but I'm starting to understand the shape of it. The wind moved through the barn planks, cold and smelling like coming rain. Gideon Hale stood with his dead wife's ledger in his hands and looked like a man who had just discovered that the thing he'd been unable to understand for 4 years had in fact been perfectly understandable. He'd just been missing a piece of it. "What do you need?" he said. "More time," Clara said, "and access to everything. Every paper you have from the last 4 years. Don't throw anything away." "All right. And I need you to not say anything to Voss yet, or to anyone who might say something to Voss." She met his eyes. "Can you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. "You think he'll come after us if he knows we're looking?" "I think he's been very comfortable for a very long time," she said, "and people who are very comfortable don't stay that way quietly." He nodded once, handed her back the ledger. "I'll get you the other papers," he said. She took the ledger and walked back toward the house, and the wind moved through the valley grass, and the creek ran cold, and somewhere in the distance, over the line of hills to the east, the first gray cloud of the season's real rain was beginning to build. Clara Whitmore did not notice the rain. She was thinking about numbers, the shape of what she had, and the shape of what she still needed to find, and the particular patience required to take something apart carefully enough that it can't be put back together. She was good at patience. It was the thing life had given her in place of everything else. She was going to use it. The rain came in that night and stayed for 3 days. Clara worked through all of it. She sat up at the kitchen table after supper each evening, the lamp pulled close, Eleanor Hale's ledger opened beside Gideon's, and the 4 years of accumulated receipts spread across the table in the order she'd imposed on them. The rain made a particular sound on the roof of this house, lower and more resonant than her father's place had been, something to do with the pitch of the shingles or the age of the wood, and she found after the first night that she didn't mind it. It was easier to think when the world outside had gone quiet and gray. What she was finding in the papers was not a simple thing. She'd expected, when she first opened Eleanor's ledger, to find something obvious, a single fraudulent transaction, a number that didn't match, the kind of clean dishonesty that could be circled in red and handed to a county judge. What she found instead was the particular architecture of someone who was very good at not being caught. Silas Voss's arrangement with the Cutler Creek Ranch had been in place for 11 years, beginning 2 years before Eleanor died and continuing without interruption through Gideon's unwitting management of the accounts that followed. The fraud was layered, grazing rights fees recorded at one amount but collected at another, improvements to shared water infrastructure billed to the ranch while being physically performed on Voss's property. Small adjustments to cattle tallies at sale time that individually meant nothing and collectively meant a great deal. It was patient work. The kind of work that required someone to believe, year after year, that the rancher on the other side of the equation would never look too closely. Gideon had never looked too closely. Clara did not say this to him. She didn't need to. On the 4th morning, the rain broke and the sun came back hard and clear, and she went out to find him. He was mending fence along the north pasture, driving posts with a methodical rhythm that suggested he'd been at it for a while. She walked the fence line to reach him, her boots dark with wet grass by the time she got there. "I have an approximate number," she said. He stopped swinging, looked at her. 11 years, she said, somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 total, depending on what I can verify against the sale records at the stockyard. Possibly more. There are 2 years of records I don't have, and I don't know how to get without tipping him off that we're looking. Gideon set the post driver down carefully, like he was handling something fragile. He was quiet for a long moment. A meadowlark called twice from somewhere in the pasture and then stopped. $8,000, he said. Approximately. That's, he exhaled slowly. That's almost everything I've lost over 4 years, Clara. I thought it was the cattle sickness. I thought it was my own bad management. Some of it may have been, she said, because she wasn't going to give him false comfort. But most of it was him. He turned and looked out over the pasture where the wet grass was already beginning to dry at the tips, going gold again in the morning light. She watched his profile. The set of his jaw, the way his hands had closed around nothing, opened again. "What do we do with this?" he said. "We finish building the case before we do anything with it." She crossed her arms against the cool air. "The stockyard records are public. I can request them through the county land office without giving a reason. Routine record check, that's all. If the sale tallies don't match what Voss reported back to you, we have corroborated fraud. That's different from what we have now, which is suggestive but disputable." "You think he'll dispute it?" "I think a man who's been doing something for 11 years without consequence has a great deal of confidence in his ability to keep doing it. Yes, he'll dispute it, and he'll have lawyers who are better at it than him." She paused. "We need the documents to be undeniable." Gideon picked up the post driver again. He held it without doing anything with it, just the weight of it in his hands. "How long?" "A few weeks, maybe a month." He nodded once, slowly, and went back to his work. She turned and walked back toward the house, and she was almost to the gate when he called after her. "Clara?" She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for looking." She didn't turn around. "I'm earning my $14, she said, and kept walking, and she didn't let her face do whatever it was trying to do until she was through the gate and past the barn and out of his sightline. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life, and she'd had some strange weeks recently. She sent the record request to the county land office under Gideon's name, drafted in the careful official language she'd copied from a sample in a legal reference book she'd found on the shelf in the small office. Apparently Eleanor had owned it, which said something further about Eleanor Hale that Clara was storing away without quite knowing why. The response came back in 12 days. She opened it at the kitchen table before Gideon was up, and she read it twice, and she made a note in her own ledger. The discrepancies in the cattle tally records were worse than she'd estimated, not by a little. She kept that to herself while she worked through the arithmetic a second time, because she did not want to bring Gideon a number that turned out to be wrong. She had one chance to lay this out cleanly, and she was not going to rush it. In the meantime, the ranch had other problems that required attention, because ranches always do. Clem and Roy were competent hands in the way that most frontier ranch hands were competent, capable of specific tasks when given clear direction, less reliable when left to determine their own priorities. Dutch was a different order of person, and she'd understood that from the second day. He had been running this operation's daily labor for 9 years and knew it better than Gideon in some respects, and the stiff courtesy he'd shown her in the beginning had shifted, sometime in the third week, into something that felt more like provisional respect. He started telling her things, small things, which pasture needed rotation and hadn't gotten it, that the south fence had a weak section she hadn't seen yet, that the hay supplier they'd been using charged more than a competitor 2 miles further out, who most people didn't bother with because of the extra distance. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked him one afternoon, when he'd followed her to the barn to mention that the water trough in the east lot had a slow leak she should know about. Dutch considered this. He was not a man who considered things for show. When he paused, it was because he was actually thinking. "Because you're doing something with it," he said finally. "You're the first person in a few years who is." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like an observation, the way Dutch made most observations, flat and accurate and not particularly softened. She took it as he'd meant it. She fixed the water trough herself. It took an afternoon and a particular kind of patience with the sealant, which had to be applied in thin layers and allowed to set between them, and she got it wrong the first time and had to scrape it and start over. Her hands were a mess by the end of it. She didn't especially mind. There was something she'd been discovering about this kind of work, the physical, practical, unglamorous kind, which was that it had an honesty to it that she found easier to live with than most other things. You either fixed the trough or you didn't. There was no room for the kind of vague social arithmetic she'd spent her whole life trying to calculate. Roy noticed the trough and said, without particular ceremony, "Huh, that's been leaking since May." She went back to her numbers. Gideon was not an easy man to know, and she wasn't trying to know him. That was what she told herself. But living in proximity to someone produced a knowledge of them that didn't require intention. You couldn't help noticing, over enough mornings, the way a person moved through a house. What she noticed about Gideon Hale was this: he was meticulous about his work and careless about himself in roughly equal measure. He fixed things. He maintained the equipment with a consistency that none of the hands matched. He kept his word in small ways. If he said he'd check the south pasture in the morning, he checked it. And she had learned early that small kept words were actually a more reliable indicator than large ones, which people tended to make without thinking. He ate without much investment in the eating, which she thought was probably a 4-year habit. He slept less than he should have. She knew this because she was also sleeping less than she should have, and she could hear him up before 4 most mornings, moving around downstairs in the dark. They were not friends. She was cautious about the word. But there were evenings after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had been cleared, when they sat at opposite ends of the table with their separate work and the lamp between them, and the silence was a kind she had not experienced before. Not hostile, not expectant, not the loaded quiet of 2 people waiting for something. Just 2 people occupied with what they were doing and not requiring anything else from the moment. She'd had almost no experience of silence like that. She was working through the last of the stockyard records on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after she'd arrived, when she found the land survey notation. It was buried in a footnote in the county land records she'd requested along with the cattle tallies, a boundary survey from 8 years ago, filed under Silas Voss's name, that described the western edge of his property in terms that overlapped, by her reading, with the eastern edge of the grazing rights Gideon held by original deed. She set down her pen and read it twice. Then she got up and went to the office and pulled out the original Cutler Creek deed, which she'd found weeks ago and set aside because she hadn't known what to do with it yet. She spread both documents on the table under the lamp and looked at them side by side. "Gideon," she said. He came to the doorway. He'd been sitting by the fire. He did that sometimes in the evenings, she'd noticed, just sitting, not reading or working. She had chosen not to remark on it. "Come look at this," she said. He came to the table. She pointed to the boundary description in the survey, then to the corresponding section in the deed. She let him read both without explaining. She wanted to know if he saw it. He read. He went very still. "That's not right," he said. "No, it isn't. That line," he traced it with his finger without touching the paper. "That's our eastern water access. If that survey is correct, we don't own the approach to the creek on that side, but we've used it for 30 years, Clara said. "Your deed predates his survey by at least a decade." Someone redrew the boundary. He looked at her. "This is bigger than the financial fraud," she said. "The money, that's $6,000 to $8,000, and it's serious. But this," she tapped the survey. "If that boundary holds up in court, he can file for access rights to your water approach. In a dry year, Gideon, that's the ranch. That's everything." He sat down in the chair at the desk. She remained standing, watching him take it in. "He's been doing this a long time," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. "He's been doing this very carefully for a long time," she said. "The survey is filed correctly. The paperwork looks legitimate. Someone with less experience with documents wouldn't see the problem." She paused. "I want to know if there's an original survey, something that predates his." "My father bought this land in 1847, Gideon said. "There would have been a survey at purchase." "Where would it be?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a box," he said slowly. "I haven't—" "Eleanor handled the old papers. There's a tin box in the attic. I haven't opened it since she died." Clara looked at him steadily. She understood from the way he'd said it that the box meant more than the papers in it. "I can look," she said. "Or you can look. Or we can do it together, but we need what's in it." He looked at the desk, at the 2 documents spread under the lamp. He looked at them for a long moment. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we'll look together." The attic was cold and smelled like thyme, old cloth and dry wood and something faintly floral that she thought might have been sachets left by Eleanor Hale years ago and long since faded. There were trunks, a broken chair, a wooden cradle pushed against the far wall that neither of them mentioned. Gideon moved through the space like a man who was being careful about where he put his weight, not because the floor was uncertain, but because he was. He found the box against the north wall, behind a stack of folded wool blankets. It was tin, latched but not locked. He brought it to Clara and held it in a way that made it clear he was handing it to her to open. She opened it. Old papers, folded along lines that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft and brown at the edges. Letters, a marriage certificate, a christening record, and at the bottom, in a separate fold of oilcloth, a land survey. Dated 1847, signed by a county assessor whose name was not the same as the assessor who'd filed Voss's version. She unfolded it carefully, both hands, the paper exhaling a dry smell. She read the boundary description. It did not match Silas Voss's survey. Her eastern water access was where it had always been, where it was supposed to be. "We have it," she said. Gideon was looking not at the survey but at the letters underneath it, the folded ones she hadn't touched. She didn't ask about them. She rewrapped the survey in the oilcloth with careful hands, and she carried it downstairs, and she set it on the desk beside the other documents, and she stood and looked at all of it. 6 weeks of work, 11 years of fraud, a forged survey, financial records that told a story of systematic theft from a man who hadn't known to look for it. It was not enough yet. She needed it organized, cross-referenced, presented in a form that a county hearing could follow without losing the thread. But it was getting there. She heard Gideon come down the stairs behind her, and she didn't turn around. Outside the window, the valley was bright in the October morning, the grass going dry and gold, the creek catching the light in the way it did when the sun hit it at a particular angle. "Silas Voss is coming to the ranch on Saturday," Gideon said. She turned then. "What?" "He comes twice a year to discuss the grazing arrangement. It's been scheduled for 3 weeks." He paused. "I forgot to tell you." Clara looked at him. "He cannot know what we've found." "I know." "You cannot give him any indication?" "Clara." His voice was quiet and a little tired. "I've been sitting across from Silas Voss twice a year for 4 years not knowing he was robbing me. I can sit across from him once more knowing it." A pause. "I'm better at this than I look." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. She turned back to the desk and began carefully to organize what they had. Saturday was 4 days away. 4 days to prepare a documentation of 11 years of fraud tight enough that when Silas Voss sat at this table and said whatever polished thing he had prepared to say, she would be ready. She had been invisible her entire life. She had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated by people who should have known better and people who didn't care to. She was going to use every bit of it. Silas Voss arrived on Saturday morning in a good coat and a better mood, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how safe he felt. He was not what she had expected, which she acknowledged was her own failure of imagination. She had built him in her mind as something obvious, thick-necked, loud, the kind of man whose corruption announced itself. The man who climbed down from the polished buggy and shook Gideon's hand in the yard was none of that. He was 60 or near it, lean and well-kept, with silver hair and the particular ease of someone who had been comfortable for so long that comfort had become invisible to him, the way water is invisible to a fish. He had a pleasant face. He smiled readily. He looked at Clara the way men of his type often looked at her, a single sweeping assessment that concluded she was not worth a second one, and then he looked away. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen window, where she could hear the conversation on the porch but not be seen, and she listened to Silas Voss talk to Gideon about the grazing season and the cattle prices and a new road being proposed through the county, and she listened to the particular rhythm of his speech, smooth, confident, the kind of voice that had never once expected to be contradicted. She listened and she made herself memorize it, because she was going to need to know how he talked when he felt safe, so she could recognize the shift when he didn't. Gideon was, as he'd said, better at this than he looked. He sat with Voss on the porch for an hour and gave nothing away. She knew because she was watching for it, the way you watch a card player's hands rather than their face. He talked about the fall calves and the fence repairs and the feed situation, and when Voss mentioned the grazing arrangement and proposed a minor adjustment to the water access schedule, casual, almost an afterthought, Gideon said he'd have to look at the deed language before agreeing to changes, and could they table it until next time? And Voss said, of course, no hurry, and smiled and meant none of it. After he left, Gideon came inside and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and drank half of it before he said anything. "He's going to move on the water access," he said. That wasn't a casual mention. "No," Clara agreed. "It wasn't." She was already at the desk. "We're not ready yet. We need 3 more weeks, maybe 4. Can we hold him off that long?" "You just held him off for an hour without him suspecting anything." She didn't look up from the papers. "Yes." He finished his coffee, set the cup down. "You were watching from the window." "I was listening." A pause. "What did you think?" She considered the question honestly. "I think he's been doing this so long he doesn't think of it as doing anything anymore. It's just the way things are. His things." She sorted a page into its place in the documentation. "That's useful, actually. People who feel safe make mistakes." Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then he went back outside, and she heard him pick up where he'd left off with the fence posts, and she went back to the work. Crotchet. The rumors started the following week. She didn't hear them directly at first. The ranch was 9 miles from town, and she hadn't been back since the morning of the auction, which suited her. Dutch came back from a supply run on Wednesday with a look on his face that she'd learned to read, which was the look of a man who had heard something and was deciding whether to say it. She let him decide. He came to the kitchen after supper when Gideon was still outside. "There's talk in town," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way he did when he was uncomfortable. "About you." She looked up from the ledger. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that gets started when somebody wants to make a person seem less credible." He said it plainly, without decoration, which she appreciated. "People saying you came here under false pretenses, that you've been pushing Gideon toward decisions that aren't in his interest, that the reason the ranch has been struggling is that he took on that you've been costing him more than you're worth." She held very still. "Who's saying it?" "Started at Marchetti's feed store. I don't know who to, but it got from there to the barber shop, and once it's in the barber shop, it's everywhere." He paused. "People are repeating it. Some of them, you know how it is, Clara. Some of them have been waiting for a reason." She knew how it was. She had known how it was since she was 12 years old and the valley had first decided what it thought of her. "Is Gideon hearing it?" she asked. "He'll hear it. Maybe already has." She closed the ledger. "Thank you for telling me." Dutch put his hat back on and went out, and she sat alone in the kitchen and looked at the lamp and felt the specific familiar weight of it. The knowledge that somewhere, in a barber shop or a feed store or across someone's dinner table, her name was being used as an argument, her existence as evidence of someone else's point. She had been here before. She knew its contours. She also knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that this time was different, not because she was different, but because she had something she hadn't had before. She had documents. She had arithmetic. She had a forged survey and 11 years of fraudulent billing recorded in 2 separate ledgers that corroborated each other. Silas Voss could say whatever he wanted about her. He could make the whole valley say it. She was going to answer him with a paper trail. She told Gideon that evening. He was at the fireplace when she came in from the desk, and she sat in the chair across from him. Not her usual spot. She typically didn't sit in the main room, but she needed to see his face for this. "You've heard the rumors," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Some of them." "And?" "And I'm asking myself why a man who has no interest in this ranch or anyone on it would suddenly be interested in spreading stories about my housekeeper." He said it quietly. "I think we made him nervous somehow, the Saturday visit." She shook her head. "He wasn't nervous on Saturday. He was comfortable on Saturday. I think he made inquiries afterward, who you'd taken on, where I came from, and he found out enough to worry about." She paused. "My father's land. The debts. The auction." She said it matter-of-factly, because if she let herself feel the shape of it, she'd lose track of what she was trying to say. It's easy to make a story out of that. A woman with nothing who attached herself to a struggling rancher. The story tells itself. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. Outside, the October wind was doing its persistent work on the eaves. "Do you want to go?" he asked. If the difficulty this is creating for you is..." "No." She said it before he finished the sentence. I'm not going. She heard the certainty in her own voice and was briefly surprised by it. I'm not going because we are 3 weeks from having something that will end this, and I am not walking away from 3 weeks of work because a man with a buggy and a pleasant face is nervous. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. But you need to know it's going to get worse before we're ready, she said. He's going to push harder. On you, on the people in the valley. He might go to the bank about your notes. I'd check with the bank directly. Don't wait for them to contact you. And he might... She stopped. Might what? He has more resources than rumors. She chose her words carefully. A man who's built what he's built isn't going to stop at a barbershop story. Gideon said nothing. He turned back to the fire. She went back to the desk. She was right that it got worse, and she was wrong about how quickly. She had thought weeks. It was 11 days. The first sign was Roy, who came back from town with a strange expression on his face and avoided her eyes at supper. The second sign was that the small amount of credit Gideon had with the Harlan merchant Dolores Fry, dry goods, occasional hardware, was quietly withdrawn. A note delivered by the postal writer that cited a review of outstanding accounts, in language so formal it had clearly been drafted by someone other than Dolores Fry, who was a plain-spoken woman. The third sign was a visit from the county assessor's deputy, asking to inspect the property lines on the eastern pasture. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the deputy measure and write things in his notebook, and she understood that they had moved into a different phase. She went upstairs and stood in the middle of her small room and took a breath. She thought about her father's face at the auction, the practiced distance in it, the discomfort that passed for regret. She thought about Gerald Fitch's gavel and the sound it made, and the crowd, and the particular cold beauty of the September morning. She thought about the tin box in the attic and the 1847 survey in its fold of oilcloth. She went back downstairs and sent a letter to the county land office requesting a formal copy of the original deed survey. Not Voss's version, the one on record under the Cutler Creek parcel's original filing number. She knew the number. She'd memorized it 3 weeks ago. She also wrote a letter to a law firm in Dalton whose name she'd found in Eleanor Hale's correspondence. Eleanor had written to them once, 4 years ago, about a property matter that had apparently been resolved before it required their involvement. The letter she wrote now was brief. She described the nature of the fraud in general terms, the documents they held, and asked what a county hearing would require to formally contest a property survey. She did not tell Gideon about the letter to the lawyers. Not yet. She didn't know if they'd respond, and she didn't want to raise a hope she couldn't support. The response came in 9 days. They would respond to properly documented fraud claims. They named a fee she didn't have, and Gideon might. She told him about it over supper with Dutch and Dex at the table, because she had found that telling Gideon difficult things in company was sometimes easier, not because she needed the witness, but because it made the conversation about problem-solving rather than feeling, and both of them were better at problem-solving. Gideon read the letter, folded it, looked at the food on his plate for a moment. I can cover the initial fee, he said, if the rest is contingent on outcome. It says contingent on outcome. Then we do it. He went back to eating. What else? Clem, who had not spoken at the table in the entire 6 weeks Clara had been at the ranch, said, Voss been talking to Abernethy at the feed supply, too. Heard it from my cousin. He's telling people the ranch is a bad debt. Clara looked at him. In 6 weeks, she had not heard Clem volunteer information unprompted. Thank you, she said. Clem shrugged and looked at his plate. Dutch said, without looking up, he's trying to dry you up before you can move. Cut off the credit, make the suppliers nervous, get the bank looking at your notes. Standard play. He said it the way someone says something they've seen before. You've seen this before, Gideon said. Happened to a man I worked for in Nebraska 20 years ago. Big neighbor with a long reach and patience. Dutch put his fork down. The man in Nebraska didn't have what you have. He didn't have anyone who could read it. He didn't look at Clara when he said it. He didn't need to. The fire came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Voss's visit, at 4 in the morning. She woke to the smell of it first. Not the clean smell of the wood stove, but something bigger, something that reached into the house through the walls and sat in the back of the throat. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, at the window in 2 steps, and she saw the barn. The east wall was fully involved. The fire had taken the new lumber first, dry wood, freshly milled, it would have caught fast, and spread to the older structure, and the orange light of it made the whole yard into a scene from some other, hotter world. She heard shouting from the bunkhouse, heard Gideon's door. She was already dressed enough, her boots already on because she had a habit of keeping them close, and she ran. The yard between the house and the barn was chaos. The particular chaos of 4 men who know what needs doing and are trying to do 6 things simultaneously. Dex was at the water pump. Roy had the bucket line started. Clem was trying to get the horses out of the near paddock before the fire reached the fence. Dutch was at the barn door. She reached Dutch. "What's inside?" "Tack room's going," he said, his voice rough from the smoke already in the air. "Harlan's in there." Harlan was the hand she hadn't met for the first 2 weeks of her time at the ranch, because he'd been in the bunkhouse with a leg injury that was taking too long to heal. Old man, maybe 65, who walked with a cane he'd carved himself and took his meals on the bunkhouse porch. She'd been bringing him supper for 3 weeks. She knew him by the way he told bad jokes with perfect seriousness, and the way he always thanked her with the formality of a man who had been raised to say thank you and never stopped. "Where's Gideon?" she said. "Went in already," Dutch said. She looked at the barn door. The fire was on the east side, the tack room was west. There was a corridor of breathable air down the center that wouldn't last but hadn't gone yet. And she went in before she finished making the decision. The smoke inside was not as bad as it looked from outside. For the first 20 feet, she could see the shapes of the stall posts and the dark bulk of the unused equipment against the south wall. She followed the sounds. Coughing, a voice she recognized as Gideon saying something she couldn't hear over the fire's noise. She found them in the last stall. Harlan was on the ground, his bad leg at a wrong angle. He'd gone down and couldn't get back up. Gideon was under one of his arms trying to lift him, but Harlan was a large man and the angle was wrong and Gideon was coughing. She didn't speak. She got under the other arm. Getting Harlan up was not clean or easy. He cried out when his leg moved, the kind of sound a man makes when he's been trying not to make any sound, and fails. And it cost Clara both knees on the barn floor and something sharp in her left palm she didn't investigate. They got him upright between them. They moved. The corridor held until it didn't. The east wall made a sound like a decision being made, and a section of it shifted and the fire found the center beam, and the smoke dropped 6 feet in the space of 10 seconds. She felt Gideon's arm across the back of her shoulders, pushing her forward, not gentle, no time for gentle. And they came out through the barn door into the yard, and the cold air hit like water, and all 3 of them went to their knees in the dirt. Dutch was there. Dex was there. The bucket line was still working, but the east wall was lost, and they all knew it. She stayed on the ground next to Harlan until she was sure he was breathing, which took longer than felt comfortable. He was. He was also looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read through her own watering eyes. "Thank you," he said, the way he always said it. "You're welcome," she said, the way she always answered. She looked up. Across the yard, the cattle were moving. Not the normal night movement, the agitated movement of animals that have been disturbed by something beyond the fire. She heard them before she fully processed it. A sound that was wrong. A sound like the herd in the south pasture, which should have been quiet at 4 in the morning, was not quiet. Gideon was already on his feet, looking south. She saw it on his face. "They've been run," he said. The cattle, the herd that represented the ranch's primary income, the animals Gideon had spent the year rebuilding after the losses of the sickness 2 years back. Someone had put something into that south pasture, a fire, or a noise, or both, and the herd was moving, and in the dark and the terrain of the south pasture, there were 3 gullies that a running animal could go into badly. He looked at Clara, at Harlan on the ground, at the barn. "Go," she said. "The barn. We've got the barn. Clem and Roy are on the line. Go get the herd." He went. Dutch went with him. Dex kept working the pump. Clara pulled off the outer layer of her shirt and pressed it against the cut on her palm, which was deeper than she'd thought, and looked at the burning barn and then at Harlan, who was sitting up now under his own power. "Can you get to the fence?" she said. "I can try." She helped him. He made it, slowly, and she got him leaned against the post and went to take Dex's place at the pump so Dex could work the bucket line with more reach. The east wall was gone, had been gone for 20 minutes. They were keeping it from the rest of the structure. The sun came up at 5:40. By then, the fire was under control. Not out, not something that had ended well, but contained. The east wall was gone. The new lumber was ash. The tack room had survived, barely. The structure itself was standing. She sat on the ground with her back against the water trough and her palm wrapped in her shirt and watched the smoke rise into the morning sky, thin and pale against the blue. Roy came and stood near her. "Somebody said it," he said. "Back of the east wall. I saw the way it started before it got too big." She already knew. She had known since she smelled it. "Don't say that to anyone outside this ranch," she said. "I know," Roy said. She looked at her hand. She'd need to deal with it properly. She looked at the barn. She looked at the south pasture where she could hear, distantly, the sounds of Gideon and Dutch moving the herd back. She thought about 11 years, about a forged survey and a man in a good coat who had looked at her once and looked away. She thought about how much of the documentation she'd finished and how much she still needed. The answer to the second question was not 0, but it was close. Close was going to have to be enough. The cut on her palm needed 4 stitches, which Dutch put in with a needle and thread from her own sewing kit because she refused to go into Harlan for a doctor, and she refused to let Gideon do it because his hands were shaking. Dutch's hands were not shaking. He worked quickly and without comment and tied off the last stitch with the same no-ceremony precision he applied to everything else. "Decent work," she said, examining it. "Don't get it dirty," he said, and went back to the barn assessment. Gideon had gotten the herd back. Not all of it. 3 animals had gone into the south gully in the dark, and one of them hadn't come back up, which was a loss that sat at the table with them at breakfast and didn't speak but was present. He came in from the south pasture at 7 in the morning, covered in dust and dried creek mud, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the bandaged hand and then at her face, and then he sat down heavily in the chair and put both his elbows on the table. "Tell me what you need to finish the documentation," he said. "I'm close," she said. "A week, maybe less." "We don't have a week before the bank hears about this." He looked at the table. "A fire, cattle losses. Carveth at the bank is already nervous about the note. If Voss gets to him first with a story about how the ranch is failing, then we go to the hearing before the bank moves," she said. He looked up. "You just said a week." "I said maybe less." She sat across from him with her coffee, her bandaged hand in her lap. "I need the stockyard records from the last 2 years. The ones I couldn't get through the county office because they're filed under Voss's business account. If I can get those, I have a complete picture. Without them, I have a gap, and a good lawyer will put his client's innocence in the gap." "How do you get records from his business account?" "I don't," she said. "But the stockyard manager keeps his own copies, independent of what gets filed with the county." She'd learned this from Harlan, who had been a working hand for 40 years and knew the practical geography of every institution in the valley. He told her about it on the bunkhouse porch 2 weeks ago, between bad jokes, without knowing why she was asking. "His name is Edgar Pruitt. He's been the Harlan stockyard manager for 18 years. "I know Edgar." "Would he talk to you?" "He'd talk to me." A pause. "He doesn't have any particular love for Voss. Voss tried to push him out 5 years ago when he wanted his own man in the job. Didn't work, but Edgar remembers it." Clara nodded slowly. "Then go today. Don't write. Go in person. Tell him you're doing a routine review of your sale records for insurance purposes, which is true enough. Ask for copies of your transaction records for the last 4 years. She met his eyes. "Don't mention Voss." Gideon stood up from the table. He hadn't eaten anything. She pushed the plate of cornbread toward him without comment, and he took a piece automatically and went to get his coat. He was back by early afternoon with 4 years of stockyard transaction records in a leather folder, and she had the kitchen table cleared and waiting. She went through them against her existing documentation while he stood near the window, looking out at the burned section of the barn. She could see him tallying it, the repairs needed, the cost, the time, the math of a loss. She understood that kind of math intimately. She let him do it while she did her own. It took her 2 hours. When she set the pen down and sat back, the numbers on the page in front of her were no longer approximate. They were specific. They were verifiable against 4 independent sources, and the total, adjusted for what could be proven in an 1880 county hearing with the documentation she held, was $9,400 across 11 years. Not 6 to 8,000, 9,400. Plus the fraudulent land survey that had been filed to encroach on property Gideon's family had owned for 30 years. She sat with that for a moment. Gideon. He came to the table. She showed him the final figure, walked him through the last reconciliation, explained what each source corroborated. She watched him take it in with the same stillness she'd seen the first time she'd shown him Eleanor's ledger. The stillness of a man absorbing something that changes the size of a thing he already knew was bad. 9,000, he said. 400, yes. He looked me in the eye twice a year for 11 years. He did. Gideon turned away from the table and walked to the window and stood with his back to her. She waited. She was good at waiting. When can we go to the county office? He said, without turning around. I want one more day to organize the presentation, she said. The documents need to be in the right order, or we lose people at the start and they don't come back. She paused. The hearing. Do you know when the next one is scheduled? 2 weeks from Thursday. We need to be on the agenda. Can you get us on the agenda? He turned around. I can try. Don't try, she said. Do it. Go tomorrow. In person, not by letter. She looked at him directly. And Gideon, when you go, take Dutch. Don't go alone. He understood what she meant. He nodded. Tjum. The day she spent alone with the documents was the hardest kind of work she knew. Not physically difficult, but requiring the kind of sustained attention that left a person emptied out at the end of it. She organized the evidence into a sequence that told a story because a county hearing wasn't a mathematics examination. People needed to follow a narrative. They needed to understand where it started, how it built, and where it arrived. She created a summary document, clear, brief, without the kind of dense accounting language that would lose a room full of ranchers and merchants and county officials in the first paragraph. She had to explain fraud to people who hadn't been looking for it. That required a different kind of clarity than explaining it to herself. She worked until the lamp burned low and then trimmed it and worked some more. And when she finally went to bed, her hand ached under the stitches, and her eyes felt wrong, and she fell asleep in the small room with the east-facing window without any of the usual difficulties she had with sleep. She dreamed about nothing she could remember in the morning. They got on the hearing agenda. Gideon came back from town the next evening with confirmation from the county clerk. They were scheduled for Thursday's session, second item on the agenda after a water rights dispute between 2 farms on the north end of the valley. He also came back with news. Voss knows, he said. He came into the kitchen and put his hat on the table and sat down. He's been to see the county clerk already. Filed a preemptive statement claiming the request is retaliatory, that I've been disputing legitimate business arrangements because I'm in financial difficulty and looking for someone to blame. Clara had expected this. She had not expected it quite so fast, which meant Voss had eyes on the county office, which meant someone had told him about their registration on the agenda within hours. He's going to have a lawyer at the hearing, Gideon said. So will we, she said. Clara, the fee. I wrote to them 2 weeks ago, she said. They've agreed to contingent terms. We pay the initial consultation. They take the rest from the settlement if we win. She watched him process this. I should have told you earlier. I didn't want to build on it until I knew the offer was solid. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been doing this for a month. I've been doing what the situation needed. That's not... He stopped. Started again. I'm saying thank you, Clara. I'm saying it badly, but that's what I'm saying. She looked at the table. The gratitude made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't fully explain, so she didn't try to. We're not through it yet, she said. He went to bed. She stayed at the table another hour, going through the presentation sequence one more time, looking for the weaknesses a lawyer would find and trying to shore them up. The weakest point was the survey. She had the 1847 original from the tin box in the attic. She had a formal copy from the county land office of Voss's filed version. The discrepancy was clear to anyone who could read a land description, but Voss's lawyer would argue that survey methodology had changed, that errors in the original were corrected by the later filing, that this was an administrative matter, not a fraudulent one. She needed someone who could testify to the survey discrepancy as an expert, someone with professional standing in land measurement. She didn't know such a person. She went to see Harlan. He was on the bunkhouse porch in the cold morning, his bad legs stretched out, drinking coffee. She sat in the other chair and told him what she needed and watched him think. "Martin Keyes," he said after a minute. "Who is he?" "Retired county surveyor, lives about 4 miles north past the Aldrich place. He did the original mapping for half the valley in the 1850s. Particular man, doesn't like to be bothered." Harlan paused. He really doesn't like Silas Voss. Voss tried to hire him once to file a survey Keyes knew was inaccurate, and Keyes told him what he could do with his money. Clara stood up. "Can I borrow the small horse?" Martin Keyes was 70 years old, and particular in the way of someone who had spent a career dealing with the consequences of imprecision and had no patience left for it. His house was immaculate. His files were organized in a manner that made Clara's kitchen table work look casual. He kept her standing at the door for 3 full minutes while he looked her over and made some internal calculation she was not privy to. Then he said, "You better come in." She showed him both surveys. She didn't say much. She let him read, which was the right instinct, because Martin Keyes was not a man who needed things explained to him. He read the 1847 document first, slowly, running a finger along the boundary descriptions. Then he read Voss's filed version. Then he set both down on his kitchen table and looked at them side by side. "This isn't a methodology difference," he said. "No," she agreed. "That eastern line has been moved 40 feet. Deliberately." He tapped Voss's version with one finger. "I've seen errors in surveys. This isn't an error. Whoever drew this knew exactly what they were drawing." "Would you be willing to say that at a county hearing?" He looked at her over the top of the documents with the specific expression of a man who is about to say something that has been true for a long time and is tired of it being unrequited. "I have been waiting," he said, "for 7 years to say something exactly like that in exactly that kind of setting." He paused. "What time does it start?" "Oh." The Thursday hearing fell on a cold morning with a clear sky, the kind of November day that looked welcoming from inside and wasn't. Clara had not been back to Harlan since September. She had not been back since her father handed her a bundle of clothing and stepped away from the auctioneer's platform. The town looked the same. It always did. That was the thing about a place that had known you a long time. It didn't change to accommodate what had happened to you in it. The square was the same square. She didn't look at the land office platform. She looked forward. The county meeting hall was already crowded when they arrived, which surprised her until she understood that it shouldn't have. This was a small valley. News of what was being heard today had traveled, and people had come the way they came to anything that promised consequence, quietly curious, some already decided, most watching to see which way the weight fell before they committed their own. She saw faces she recognized. Millicent Howe, Tom Abernethy, the Platt sisters, Ruth DeLacy, who was watching the door with an expression Clara couldn't read. She also saw Silas Voss at the front of the room with a man in a city suit who was carrying a briefcase and had the posture of someone accustomed to being the most qualified person present. Voss looked over when they came in. He looked at Gideon, a long, measuring look. He looked at Clara for slightly less time than that. She held his gaze until he looked away. They sat at the table on the right side of the room, Martin Keyes beside them with his own folder of notes, the Dalton lawyer, a thin man named Graves who communicated primarily in understatement, on Gideon's other side. The water rights matter took 40 minutes. Clara did not hear a word of it. She was looking at the documentation in her hands and going through the sequence one more time. The way you check a thing you've already checked because the alternative to checking it is sitting with the uncertainty. Then the commissioner called their matter. Voss's lawyer went first, which was standard practice and also strategy. Set the frame before your opponent can. He was smooth and organized, and he made the preemptive retaliatory claim sound reasonable, the language of it designed to make Gideon look like a failing rancher grasping for an explanation, and Clara a convenient instrument of that desperation. He was good at his work. She acknowledged this to herself without letting it move her. When he finished, He sat down with the confidence of a man who had done this before and won. Graves stood up. He was not a theatrical man, which she'd appreciated when she'd met him. He said simply that they had documentation they would like to present to the commissioner and asked permission to do so. Permission granted. Clara stood up. She had not discussed this with Graves in advance. She had discussed it with Gideon, briefly, and he had looked at her and said, "Go ahead," in the particular way that meant he'd already known she would need to do this. She was not a lawyer. She was not the official representative. But she was the one who understood every line of what she was about to present. And she had decided that understanding mattered more than convention. Voss's lawyer objected. The commissioner, a tired-looking man named Burwell, who had been doing this for 12 years, and had the face of someone who had seen most varieties of human behavior and was rarely surprised, looked at Clara and said, "Are you the one who built this case?" "Yes," she said. "Then go ahead," he said. She started with the financial records. She went through them methodically, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of someone who wants to be understood rather than impressive. She showed the double billings from Marchetti Brothers, the grazing rights fees recorded at one amount and collected at another, the systematic discrepancies in the cattle tallies verified against the stockyard records Edgar Pruitt had provided. She showed Eleanor Hale's ledger alongside Gideon's, the two accounts of the same transactions telling incompatible stories. She showed the math. All of it. $9,400, 11 years, verifiable against 4 independent sources. The room was quiet in a way rooms get when they are paying attention. Voss's lawyer interrupted twice. Both times she waited for him to finish and then continued from where she'd been. The second time, Commissioner Burwell told the lawyer to let her complete her presentation before raising objections. Then she turned to the survey. She placed both documents on the commissioner's table. She stepped back and let Martin Keyes come forward, and Martin Keyes, with the calm authority of a man who had measured this valley's land for 30 years and knew every inch of what he was talking about, explained in precise technical language and then in plain language for the room exactly what the difference between the two surveys meant and why it was not an error. The eastern boundary in Mr. Voss's filed survey, he said, has been moved 40 feet to the west of the boundary described in the original 1847 deed survey. This moves the approach to Cutler Creek off the Hale property and onto land that was subsequently acquired by Mr. Voss. That is not a surveying discrepancy. That is a redrawn line. The room was not quiet anymore. It was the kind of not quiet that happens when a lot of people are trying not to be heard making noise. Silas Voss spoke for the first time. He stood up. "This is fabrication. That woman has been Mr. Voss." Commissioner Burwell's voice didn't rise, but it had an edge that had clearly been sharpened by 12 years of exactly these moments. "You'll have your opportunity. Sit down." Voss sat down. His face was not pleasant anymore. She looked at it and thought that this was the first true expression she had seen on him. Everything before this had been the face he chose, and this was the face underneath it. It was smaller than she'd expected, more ordinary. Graves stood and made the formal claim, fraud, property encroachment, unjust financial enrichment, and submitted the complete documentation package to the commissioner's record. Then it was Voss's lawyer's turn. He was still good. He raised every objection she'd anticipated and several she hadn't, questioned the provenance of Eleanor's ledger, the reliability of the stockyard records, the authority of Martin Keyes to testify on the survey as a private citizen rather than a currently licensed assessor. He was organized and sharp, and he worked the room's uncertainty the way a skilled man works a weak board, probing for the soft spots. But he didn't have documents. He had arguments. And at a certain point, when the documents are organized and verified and cross-referenced and sitting on the commissioner's table, arguments are what you use when you don't have anything better. Commissioner Burwell recessed for 30 minutes. Clara sat at the table and drank water from the pitcher Dex had appeared from somewhere with, and she did not speak to anyone, and she looked at the wall. Gideon said quietly, "You all right?" "Ask me in 30 minutes, she said. When Burwell came back, he didn't sit down. He stood at the front of the room and read from the notes he'd made, and as he read, Clara understood from the structure of it, the way his language moved from the documented claims to the conclusions, what the finding was going to be before he said it. Silas Voss was required to appear before the county court within 30 days to answer formal charges of financial fraud and property survey falsification. His assets were to be frozen pending investigation. The eastern boundary claim was suspended pending court review of the original 1847 survey. A referral was being made to the county sheriff. The room reacted. She heard it from far away. Across the room, 2 county deputies who had been standing near the door moved toward Silas Voss, and Voss looked at them and then looked at Clara. Really looked at her, the long, direct look he hadn't given her in September, and hadn't given her when he'd come to the ranch, and hadn't given her at the start of this hearing. He looked at her the way you look at something you missed, and are now paying for having missed. She held his look without expression. The room was standing. Not everyone, but enough that she was aware of the sound of chairs and the movement of people who had come to watch, and were now doing something else with the energy of what they'd witnessed. She heard her own name said by a voice she didn't immediately recognize as approving. She sat in her chair at the table and looked at the documentation still spread in front of her, all those pages, all those numbers, all those months of someone's careful theft recorded in the handwriting of a woman who was 4 years dead and had known something was wrong and had written it all down. She thought about Eleanor Hale, who she had never met. She thought that Eleanor would have appreciated the arithmetic. Dutch was standing near the wall. He caught her eye when she looked up, and he nodded once. The same nod he'd given her on the first day, standing by the barn, the inventory look that had concluded she was worth attention. It meant something different now. She was not sure she could name it, but she felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way that was not nothing. Gideon was beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did speak, his voice was careful and quiet under the noise of the room. "What do you need?" he said. She almost laughed. It was what she had said to him that morning in the kitchen with Eleanor's ledger on the table between them 2 months ago. She wondered if he remembered. "Right now?" she said. "I'd like to go home." He stood, and she stood, and they walked out of the county meeting hall into the November afternoon, and the cold air was clean after the closed heat of the room, and she breathed it in and did not look back at the building behind them. The wagon was at the north end of the square, where it had always been. She climbed up without assistance and waited while Gideon untied the horse, and Dex came running from somewhere with an expression of barely contained relief, and Dutch walked up from the direction of the hall with his steady, unhurried gait. The square was the same square it had always been. She had been sold in it in September, on a morning that had started as an ordinary one. She looked at it for a moment. Then she faced forward. Gideon climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they pulled out onto the road heading west, into the afternoon sun, toward the valley and the creek and the half-burned barn that still needed its east wall replaced. They were 3 miles out of town before either of them spoke. "The lawyer's fees," Gideon started, "will come from the settlement," she said, "and the barn. We'll figure out the barn." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara, Gideon, I don't know how to, He stopped. The road curved, and he guided the horse through the turn with the automatic ease of a man who had driven this road 1,000 times. "I keep starting sentences I don't know how to finish today." "Then don't finish them," she said. "Not today." He nodded. The wagon moved west, and the sun was low and orange in the sky ahead of them, and the valley appeared below them as they came over the last hill, the grass and the creek and the house on its slight rise, and the barn with its damaged wall. It looked, she thought, like something worth the work. The barn's east wall went up in the first week of December, which was later than anyone wanted and earlier than anyone had believed possible, given everything that had happened in between. Gideon and Clem and Roy worked it over 4 days, Dutch supervising from a camp stool because his knee had finally given him the trouble it had been threatening all fall, and Harlan sat on the bunkhouse porch in his coat and commented on the progress in the particular way of a man who cannot help and has decided to be useful through criticism. Clara brought coffee out twice a day and did not comment on Harlan's commentary, which she thought showed considerable restraint. The settlement proceedings moved slower than the barn. Graves, the Dalton lawyer, had written twice in November with updates that were cautious in the way of lawyers who have been doing this long enough to know that things that look finished often aren't. Voss had retained a firm out of the capital. His assets were frozen but not yet distributed. The criminal referral was with the county sheriff's office, where it was being reviewed by a man named Aldous, who had a reputation for thoroughness that was either admirable or frustrating depending on how urgently you needed him to finish. Clara read the letters and wrote back with questions and filed the responses in the folder she'd made for the legal correspondence, and she did not let herself think too much about the money yet, because the money was not real until it was real, and building a life around something that hadn't arrived yet was a way of making yourself fragile. She had been fragile enough in her life. She was done with it as a condition. The letter from Dalton arrived on a Wednesday, which was otherwise an unremarkable day, cold, clear, the kind of winter light that had no warmth in it, but was honest about that fact, which she appreciated. It was not from Graves. It was from a firm called Harwick and Sons, and the man who had written it was the younger son, a Robert Harwick, who introduced himself as a specialist in frontier territory land and commerce law, and who had apparently been following the Voss proceedings with professional interest. He had a proposal. He needed a bookkeeping and records specialist for his firm's Dalton office, someone who could organize documentation, identify discrepancies in land and financial records, assist in building cases for clients who had been defrauded by exactly the kind of systematic scheme she had dismantled in the Harlan County hearing. He had heard about that hearing from 3 separate people, which told him something about both the quality of the work and the size of what she had accomplished. The salary he named was $40 a month, more than 3 times what she was making. He offered a start date in February, housing allowance included, a position with genuine legal standing, professional recognition, work that mattered in a city where her past was unknown and her name was clean. She read it twice at the kitchen table in the morning quiet, before anyone else was up. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and looked out the window at the frost on the east pasture and the creek beyond it catching the early light. She sat with it for a long time. She told Gideon about it that evening. She had considered not telling him, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she knew that whatever he said in response would matter to her, and she hadn't yet decided how much she wanted it to matter. That was an honest accounting of where things stood between them, which was somewhere without a clean name. Not friendship, not employment, not the thing it might have been mistaken for from outside. Something that had grown in the particular conditions of a difficult season, the way certain plants grow in difficult soil. Not pretty, not fast, but real in the way that only things which have been tested can be real. She told him after supper, when the others had gone. She set the letter on the table between them. He read it. His face did not change in any dramatic way. He set it back down. $40, he said. Yes. That's a serious offer. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up and was doing its work on the eaves again, that persistent low sound she had stopped noticing somewhere around week 5, and now noticed again in the specific way you notice something when you are aware you might be leaving it. What are you going to do? He said. I don't know yet, she said, which was true. I wanted you to know about it. He nodded. He looked at the table rather than at her. If you go, we'd manage. I want you to know that. What you've built here in terms of the systems, the accounts, I understand them now in a way I didn't. I wouldn't be starting from nothing. I know, she said. And you've earned something here, he said. The work you did. That's not a small thing. You should go somewhere that recognizes it properly, if that's what you want. She looked at him. He was still looking at the table, and she understood that this was not avoidance. This was a man being careful not to put his weight on a decision that wasn't his to make. She had met very few people in her life who understood that distinction. Most people who cared about an outcome pressed toward it without admitting they were pressing. Gideon was sitting very deliberately still. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in her pocket. I'll think about it, she said. Take the time you need, he said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the small room with its east-facing window and its single peg, and she thought about Dalton, which she had never seen, and a clean name, and $40 a month, and work that mattered done in a place where no one had seen her father step back from an auctioneer's platform. She thought about that for a while. Then she thought about the creek, about the way the valley looked from the top of the North Hill on a clear morning when the frost was still on the grass, about Harlan's bad jokes and Dutch's inventory nod, and Dex, who had fixed the well rope in an afternoon and looked startled at himself. About Eleanor Hale's ledger, the handwriting of a woman who had known something was wrong and had written it all down carefully, patiently, for whoever eventually came looking. About the tin box in the attic and the 1847 survey in its fold of oilcloth. About what it meant to find a place that needed the specific thing you were, and to find it by accident, and to make something in it that hadn't existed before you arrived. She did not sleep easily. She hadn't expected to. The settlement came through on a Friday in mid-December, 6 weeks after the hearing. Graves wrote with the final figures, net of legal fees, net of the costs Voss's lawyers had managed to dispute and reduce. The total recovery for Cutler Creek Ranch was $7,200, not the full $9,400. Settlements never returned everything, but $7,200 was more than Gideon had seen in 4 years of honest work, and it was real, and it arrived as a bank draft that Clara verified personally at the Harlan branch before she told him what it was. She also told him about the criminal outcome, which had been finalized the same week. Voss had entered a guilty plea on 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of survey falsification, in exchange for the criminal court accepting the civil settlement as partial restitution and reducing the custodial sentence to 18 months. He would serve it in the county facility in the capital. His properties were to be liquidated to cover the remainder of outstanding fraud claims from 3 other ranchers in the valley who had come forward after the hearing, people who had been waiting, apparently, to see if the first stone thrown would hold before they threw their own. When Clara read that last part, she sat with it. 3 other ranchers, 3 other families who had been losing ground, losing money, losing sleep over books that didn't balance, and arrangements that felt wrong but couldn't be named. 3 other sets of people who had been quietly diminished by the same patient confidence that had assumed they would never look closely enough. She thought about all of them, and she thought about what it meant that she had looked. She found Dutch at the barn on a Saturday morning, working on a piece of harness with the slow, methodical attention he gave everything. "You heard about the settlement," she said. "Gideon told us last night." He didn't look up from the harness. "Good number." "It's enough to rebuild the east pasture fence properly and replace the cattle loss and have something left over," she said. "The ranch is solvent, properly solvent, not just surviving." "I know." He worked the leather for a moment. "You going to Dalton?" She looked at him. "How do you know about Dalton?" Dex saw the letter on the table. He didn't read it on purpose. It was just there. Dutch set the harness down and looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "He told me. I told him to keep his eyes to himself." "I haven't decided," she said. Dutch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This place was dying before you came. I don't mean that as pressure. I mean it as a fact, because I think you're the kind of person who wants facts." He picked up the harness again. "Whatever you decide, you should know what you did here." She looked at the barn wall, the new planks on the east side, pale against the older wood, the repair that was visible and would be for years, the way repairs always were. You could fix a thing and still be able to see where it had broken. "Thank you, Dutch," she said. He nodded once. She went back to the house. She wrote to Robert Harwick 4 days before Christmas. She thanked him for the offer, which was genuine and serious, and the kind of professional recognition she would not have imagined for herself a year ago. She told him she was declining it. She told him briefly why. Not the personal reasons, which were hers, but the professional ones, which were real. She had a situation here that was not finished. The Voss recovery had identified 3 additional fraud cases in the valley that would need documentation work. There was a community of ranchers and small landowners in this territory who had been systematically taken advantage of by exactly the kind of scheme she now knew how to identify and dismantle. That work was here, not in Dalton, and she intended to do it. She did not tell him that she had stood on the North Hill in the early morning and looked at the valley below her and felt, for the first time in her memory, that she was standing somewhere she had chosen rather than somewhere she had been placed. She sealed the letter and sent it with the postal rider and did not second-guess it, which was the closest thing to certainty she knew how to have. She told Gideon on Christmas Eve because that was when she got around to it. They were in the kitchen after supper, which had been a slightly more elaborate affair than usual. Harlan had produced a bottle of something from a personal reserve that nobody had known about and nobody asked the origin of, and there had been a general loosening of the usual bunkhouse formality that Clara had watched from her end of the table with something close to warmth. Now it was late and quiet, and she set the copy of her letter on the table between them the way she'd set the Harwick letter. He read it. She watched his face, which was more readable to her now than it had been in September, when she hadn't known yet how to distinguish the controlled expression from the genuine one. What she saw was not relief, exactly. It was something quieter than that, something that had been waiting to be permitted. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying." He looked at the letter again, not because there was more to read, just the looking of someone processing a thing that is actually happening. "The fraud cases you mentioned, the other ranchers. Kemp, Aldrich, and the Barretts on the North Road," she said. "I've already spoken to all three. They have documentation situations that are going to require 6 months of work at minimum." "You spoke to them?" "Last week. I told them I wasn't certain of my situation yet, but that I would be in touch." She paused. "I'm going to need to register as a formal records and accounts specialist with the county. Graves says there's a process. It'll give me standing to present documentation in legal proceedings without needing to ask the commissioner's permission." Gideon was looking at her with the expression she had first seen on his face in the attic, holding his dead wife's tin box, the expression of a man who is being surprised by something he had been hoping for without admitting the hoping. "And the ranch accounts," she said. "I'll keep doing those. I want an adjusted wage, though, $16. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. The muscles around it, the direction of it. "You were at 14. "I've been worth considerably more than 14 since October." She held his look. 16. 15, he said. She considered this. 15 and a half. 15 and a half, he agreed, and this time the almost smile became an actual one, brief and crooked and entirely genuine, and she looked at it for one moment before she looked back at the table. "There's one other thing," he said. She waited. He reached across the table and pushed a folded document toward her. She opened it. It was a deed amendment, filed with the county land office 11 days ago, she saw from the date. It transferred a quarter interest in the Cutler Creek Ranch property, the east pasture, the creek approach, the section of land her own work had kept from falling into Voss's hands, into the name of Clara Whitmore. She looked at it for a long time. "That's your land," she said. "Your family's land. It's land you saved," he said. "Not as a gift, as what it is. You earned that section the same way my father earned the rest of it, by doing the work that kept it alive." She looked at the document, at her name in the county clerk's handwriting, Clara Whitmore, part owner of Record Cutler Creek Ranch. She had come to this valley in September with a bundle of clothing and her mother's ring and a list of supplies she'd never gotten to use. She had come with the specific kind of anger that lives in a person who has been told, in 100 small ways across a long life, that they don't deserve to take up space. She had not come here looking for anything, because she had learned young that looking for things you want is a way of collecting disappointments. She looked at the deed amendment and understood that this was the thing she had not known how to want, because she had not known it was possible. Not the land itself. The land was real, but it was not the point. The point was what the land meant. Someone had looked at her work, her mind, her stubborn, patient precision with numbers and documents and broken systems, and had said, "This is worth something. This is worth the same thing we give to people we respect." She had been sold for coins in a public square 4 months ago. She was sitting at a kitchen table on Christmas Eve with her name on a deed. She folded the document carefully and held it in both hands. "Thank you," she said. The way Harlan said it, with the full weight of it, nothing casual. "You're welcome," Gideon said, the way she always answered. The valley changed after that winter, not quickly and not without friction. Change in small communities never happens either of those ways. But it changed. The 3 fraud cases Clara worked through the following year all resulted in recoveries. Kemp got back enough to replace the herd he'd been slowly losing for 6 years. The Aldrich family's water access was legally restored in March. The Barrett situation was more complicated, The documentation older and harder to reconstruct, but by August they had a settlement that let them pay off the note that had been strangling them since Voss had quietly purchased it 2 years prior. Word moves in a valley. It moved the way water does, finding the low places first, the people who had already been suspicious, and then spreading outward. Clara began receiving inquiries. Not many at first. A woman from the North Settlement who had concerns about a timber contract. A small rancher named Finch who thought there was something wrong with his grazing lease but couldn't say what. She looked at the documents. She found what needed finding. She was not always right. She was wrong about the Finch situation. The problem turned out to be his own accounting rather than any external fraud, and she told him so plainly, which he did not take well initially and later came around to appreciating. She made errors in the Barrett documentation that required Graves to correct them, and she spent 2 days revising before the filing was right. She was building a practice the same way the barn had been rebuilt, with real materials and the visible marks of where things had broken, and no pretense that the process was anything other than work. Gideon was not a demonstrative man. He didn't become one. He said what needed saying and was quiet otherwise. And he kept his word in small ways and large ones, and he did not treat her like a fragile thing or an uncertain one, which was the gift she had not known she needed until it had been given consistently enough that she could trust it. There was an evening in early spring when the valley was mud and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and she was at the kitchen table doing the quarterly accounts, the real accounts now, organized and current and balanced to the cent. And he came in from checking the north fence and sat across from her and poured himself coffee and opened the almanac he'd been reading in pieces all winter. And they sat in the lamplight in the familiar silence, and she thought about the first evening they'd done this 4 months ago, 2 strangers occupying opposite ends of the same space. She thought about how long it takes for a place to become yours, how it isn't one moment but 100 small ones. The morning you stop noticing the particular sound the house makes, the evening you reach for something in the kitchen without having to think about where it is, the day you walk the fence line and know without looking where the weak section is, the day you realize you are not making peace with a place. You are just home. She had been told, in the explicit language of an auction and in 100 quieter ways before that she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. Too heavy, too plain, too serious, too certain of her own intelligence for someone who had been given no particular reason to be certain of anything. She had come to understand that the people who told her those things had been looking at her through the wrong lens, the lens of what she cost rather than what she built, what she took up rather than what she made. The valley had made a version of her in its collective mind that was smaller and simpler and easier to dismiss, and she had walked around it inside that version for so long she had started to believe its dimensions were real. They weren't. What was real was the deed in the desk drawer with her name on it, the accounts on the table in front of her that balanced, the 3 families with restored water rights and recovered land, Harlan's bad jokes on the porch, Dutch's nod, the east wall of the barn, new planks against old, the repair still visible and probably always would be. What was real was this valley, this creek, this kitchen table, and the man across it who read his almanac and drank his coffee, and had never once looked at her the way the square in Harlan had looked at her, never with that assessing, dismissive sweep that concluded she was not worth a second look. She was worth looking at. She had always been. It had just taken the right circumstances for anyone, including herself, to see it clearly. That was not a small thing to know. It was, in fact, everything. Outside, the spring creek ran full and cold and purposeful over its stones, moving the way water moves when it knows exactly where it's going. The lamp held steady. The valley was dark and quiet and fully, completely hers. Clara Whitmore set down her pen and balanced the last column and looked at the number at the bottom of the page, and it was right. She closed the ledger. She stayed.